Behold, my glorious supporter Faber has asked me to discuss possible future Warframe passive augments. Yes, the Warframe passive augments. This was a peculiar little update where they added 3 augments to the game that disable Nezha, Zephyr, and Titania's passives, respectively, and then give them some normal benefit that you could already have gotten in the Exilus slot. So, for example, Nezha does not slide anymore. He doesn't have reduced friction, and then you get basically power drift, like 15% strength. Let's say Titania doesn't have her vacuum anymore, but instead you get basically Aviator. And then Zephyr is the same thing as Nezha. You lose that floatiness, but you get basically power drift, a bit of power strength. So the idea of these is that if you don't want their mobility thing that is signature to them, we'll get back to Titania in a second, then you can exchange it for a benefit that would already be reasonable in the Exilus slot. Indeed, Aviator and Power Drift are 2 of the more powerful effects you can get in the Exilus slot. Cunning Drift wants to say hi. But anyway, yeah, so the thing I feel about this is that Titania, of course, like the vacuum while in Razorwing, that's not a detriment. You should never, ever get rid of that. I know that the reason people wanted to get rid of that, the few people that did want to get rid of it, is because they're thinking you can micromanage when you pick up energy orbs, but among many other things, you can always still micromanage when you pick up energy orbs, even with vacuum. You just have to stay further away from them, and Titania has a powerful ranged weapon, so that's totally unnecessary. And if you have full energy anyway, it really doesn't matter. Like, you'll waste a few here and there, but it's not, no. Like, I've been playing Warframe for 4,000 hours. That is never important. Anyway, so we're going to make ones that are. And specifically, Faber, you mentioned that we're allowed to add things rather than taking them away. So we don't have to make more augments like that. Some of you might have been thinking, oh no, not more of these. Like, more like the Titania one. That's what I'm trying to say. I think those are basically pointless. Like Zephyr and Nezha, I can sort of understand. And if people didn't like those qualities of them, I hope they enjoy those frames now, I guess. But I feel like it's 2 frames out of like 42. Again, Titania doesn't count at all. That's never a meaningful thing. And so I feel like it's a little silly to remove, you could just play someone else. Like, it's okay for 2 frames out of 42 to not be for everyone. But whatever. We're not making those kind of augments. We're making real, like, passive augments, an augmented version of a frame's passive. Now, of course, we still have more work to do. You might be saying, Zandy, for goodness sakes, just talk about give us the ideas. But a lot of discussing this concept is there's a lot of problems with it. I don't think it's a bad idea. I would love to see Warframe passive augments. The problem is that most frames don't have good or any passive. See, like, Chroma, who technically has a passive where his element changes based on whatever, but that's just the mechanic of his abilities. His other abilities, that's that ability. He doesn't really have having your passive be a mechanic of your abilities is not, you know what I mean? That would be like having synergy between 2 abilities be a passive. That's like, the passive is like something else, is the idea in my mind. And the other thing, of course, is that we need to define what a good augment is. A good augment, connected to this thing about good passives, has to be for a good ability. A lot of augments in the game are for abilities that are either the ability isn't good, but the augment is a good ability. It's not a good augment. The augment creates a good ability, but the ability wasn't any good without the augment. Or the effect of the augment shouldn't really be an augment. Like, the ability should just have that ability. Roar has an augment. Rhinos Roar has an augment that lets it refresh. That it should just be able to refresh if that's what they want. That shouldn't be an augment. It does some other effect, like a puncture proc or something, that doesn't matter. It just makes it refresh. It should just be able to refresh. Iron Skin, this has been a controversial one. Rhino's Iron Skin has an augment that lets you detonate it. It does pretty respectable damage, but the main thing is being able to refresh it. If they want you to balance out Iron Skin being tanky by you needing to refresh it and then you need an augment for that, they should just make Iron Skin weaker and let you refresh it. That's a better, the quality of life should not be hidden in the augment, right? So we can't do stuff like that. Now, I do think it's okay for us to make augments that are 2 abilities that are not great, but they're far from useless abilities. I think a good example is Mag's Polarized augment, Counterpulse. So Polarize restores shields and removes some armor, not a ton of armor, and it's a flat value of armor rather than a percent. So against very high level enemies, it doesn't really do anything. Against low level enemies, it's a waste of time because they don't have meaningful armor. And it removes shields from enemies. It's okay, like the shield restore thing can be useful, but Counterpulse is quite solid. It shuts off enemy guns and they can't shoot for a while, big area, you know, it's polarized. I think that's okay. I think it's fine to do that. So for example, now we can get into actually making them, but those are the ground rules, and that's what I think about those other augments for what it's worth. Oberon has a passive where he's a little bit better with companions, with beast companions. He gives them a 25% health, shields, and armor link, and he gives them 1 instant revive per mission. So kind of like how Sentinels have regen. He basically gives your pet regen once per mission. That is a cool idea, and because Oberon is sort of like a druid paladin, it's cool that he has a little bit of synergy with beast companions, but it's not very much. Like that, it's a good effect. Like definitely the instant revive is quite solid. The link is minor, it's a low value, like 25% link is not a ton, but it's not nothing either. It being a health link might mean it also links healing, the way link health links healing, even though it doesn't say it does. I don't know. Anyway, but what if we made it stronger? What if we had an augment that was like, instead of it just being 1 instant revive per mission, basically Oberon's passive turns into Jin's resurrection thing. I forget what that augment is called, where it can come back to life after 90 seconds, and then your pet can just come back like every 90 seconds or so. That might be a little... Is that too powerful? I don't know. Or it could give you more instant revives. It could double the effect of the passive. It could just like, the passive is doubled. You get 50% health, shields, and armor link for your pet, and you get 2 instant revives per mission. You could go a route like that. But I think it would be cool to use an augment like that to play up a theme that Oberon has. It's kind of a minor theme. It's not really utilized that much, but why not? Like, you tackle it a little bit more. It's solid to use beasts with Oberon because he's got pretty good zone control. And so if you and your pet are there, you can control area pretty well. He's pretty good at sustaining his pet. He has decent health and incentive to build toward his health, which means link health will probably keep his pet quite healthy. And he's got his heal, his grass to negate status effects. He's got some okay support for having a beast companion, especially a Kubro that can kill stuff. He can even use the mecha set to link a bunch of status, like the radiation he makes from his grass. That's not amazing or anything, but it's pretty decent. So that could be kind of cool. So stuff like that, right? So what other frames have passives that are an interesting side theme, or like they're sort of okay, but they're not amazing, you know? Who can we use? Let's see. I'm sure people are already thinking of their own ones in the comments. It's just like so many of the passives are just so weird. And again, like there's a lot of frames where I want to talk about their passive. Like Hildren doesn't really have a passive. She has a better shield gate, but they need passive updates. I'm sure Nyx has a passive, but I don't know what it is. Oh no, it's not the parkour velocity. Frost has that, like enemies hit him and they could get frozen passive. It's not really strong enough. I guess maybe it could be permissible to buff the passive. Like in this conversation, we will also buff the passive and then we'll augment it. So for example, for Frost, let's say his passive becomes enemies that hit him in melee, 100% chance to get frozen solid for like 3 seconds or whatever, and then it just has diminishing returns. So if a butcher hits you, they are frozen solid. There's no chance. It's not a cold proc. They're stunned. If he gets meleeed, the enemy gets stunned. That's not amazing or anything, but just real quick, like, okay, that is a decent passive now, you know? Okay, so now what if we augment that and make it so when an enemy is frozen solid by Frost's passive, they sort of spread the freeze effect. So this is similar to Saren's Spores, basically, but it's a frozen solid effect. Enemies can only be affected once, something like that, but it will move around. So then you have this weird incentive to get hit in melee range and freeze an enemy, and then it kind of propagates out. This would be interesting because it changes Frost's identity from sort of a camping frame, where you don't want yourself to be tanky, you want your globe to be tanky, or you want enemies to be stunned with your freeze abilities. With this augment, you actually want to get hit, and then you create a sort of powerful propagating freeze effect. I'm imagining like a snowflake branching out. Snowflakes don't do that at all. Anyway, whatever, an ice crystal branching out. There's nothing about snowflakes that does that. But you see what I mean. And then you have this sort of weird gameplay incentive to do something you weren't incentivized to do before. And I think that effect is, on paper, quite powerful. So you're giving Frost the ability to create a version of Spore that does a stun that just goes with some radius, I don't know, until it, runs out of enemies or whatever, that could be really, really powerful, right? I think it's not crazy overpowered or anything. It's only stunning like one or a few enemies at a time in all likelihood, and it can't re-stun the same enemy. We are making that rule. But it still could be pretty good, but in exchange, you have to do something Frost doesn't usually want to do. You have to get hit. Frost doesn't want to do that, not because he's so squishy, but because his other gameplay revolves around you're just not going to get hit using Frost's other gameplay. If you stay in a snow globe, you're not going to get hit. If you freeze everything with Avalanche, it's already stunned and you're not going to get hit. Maybe that defeats the point, but you have this automatic propagating CC. So you're incentivized to not do those things that are powerful, and so you're kind of giving something up, and then in exchange, you get the ability to, propagate this powerful stun effect. I don't know, you might not be sold on that, but that's more intended to be my idea for a type of augment, a sort of game design thing that I really like, is when things are balanced by their context more. So in other words, this is something I think Warframe does, maybe not always so well. Like an ability would be good in the abstract, but it's not very good on this frame. For example, Titania has her first and third ability, both pretty good CC abilities, but you don't need both of them. Like, why does the same frame have those two abilities? Like, that's just unnecessary. There are other things like Nidus has a lot of damage reduction that he really doesn't need because he has a passive that makes him immortal, or you could go the other way. Like Nidus, one of the tankiest frames in the game, has a passive that makes him not die when he would die, but he'll never die because of his other stuff in his kit. I'm not saying that's bad design necessarily. Some people like having a frame that's all about not dying. Fine. I'm just pointing out that those are cases where that design principle is used backwards, where the frame this is a good, powerful thing, not dying or having that damage reduction, or his Nidus's link, or again, Titania's CC abilities. They're good, but they would be much better on a frame that needed them more. Like, the fact that they're on this frame balances them out, although in the case of those abilities, I'm saying it needlessly balances them out. They're not such overpowered abilities that they, well, maybe Nidus, but Titania's CC abilities are not so strong that they need to be balanced by being redundant. And again, that's not really balancing. That just feels silly. Instead, we're balancing this Frost augment for his passive, his new passive, by making it forces him to kind of not use some of his advantages, and then in exchange, he gets this potential powerful effect. And again, that effect is also, the propagating CC is a little less powerful in that it's already on a frame that could stun everything, just in a very different way. So it doesn't have the problem Titania's has, where they're both basically, you cast Lantern or Spellbind on a group of enemies and they're CC'd. It's almost the same thing. The only real difference is that Lantern is more expensive and it can persist in an area. Not a meaningless difference, but a very minor difference. And technically it does damage, Whereas this is, for Frost, is quite a different type of CC. Big area CC, something Frost already has a lot of, but then he has this propagating thing. Frost leaving things in the environment is part of Frost's kit, but usually things that are very stationary, not things that move around. Could be kind of cool. Again, a little out there, but go figure. What other frames can we change passives of? So again, I'm allowing myself to buff the passive. That's I've realized that's somewhat necessary here. What are some boring passives? Excalibur's Blade passive. Yeah, that's always annoyed me. One of the first frames that you get, and his passive is just what? It's 10% damage with swords. Who cares? So let's make it good. It's a lot of damage with swords. We're gonna do 50% attack speed with one-handed and two-handed swords, Nikanas and two-handed Nikanas, and maybe that's it. Yeah. Axes? Nah, let's just stick with those. So one and two-handed swords and one and two-handed Nikanas. Excalibur has 50% attack speed. Let's go. Not 10% based. Get out of here. 50% attack speed. There we go. That's not overpowered. It's good, but it's not overpowered. And we'll say it doesn't affect Exalted Blade because that doesn't make sense. We don't need to ask that question anymore. Just make Exalted Blade's attack speed whatever you want it to be. It doesn't make any sense for his passive to buff it. That's reductive. It's like, oh, his passive also affects it. It's like, that's just this innate attack speed then. That doesn't mean anything. Cool. So now his passive is actually good, so now we can augment it. How do we augment it? When using such and such kinds of weapons, so we kind of have to stick to those kinds of weapons, you do something, something, something. So we gave it attack speed already. How about if we do some kind of like they get more finisher animation, or their heavy attack speed it increases the speed of even more things about the weapon. So like how about a large heavy attack speed, so that's wind up, and finisher animation speed increase. So we're talking like a really large one, like 300%, like infinite wind up and finishers, like maximum wind up and finisher speed. So heavy attacks when using those weapons are capped out at the minimum wind up speed, which is 0.2 seconds. And I'll remind you that attack speed also affects heavy attacks. So the other part of the passive helps too. And then finisher speed becomes like extremely fast. I don't know, we can't really make it infinite, but just really, really fast. Like that becomes really fast finishers. So what it now does is create this attitude where you get these potentially major benefits when you use very specific types of combat, when using very specific types of weapons, but they're not any good if you don't plan around them. So for example, Excalibur has a couple ways to blind. So the finisher thing is going to be like faster finishers that's very useful. That's good. Just really quick finishers that's really useful, because the problem with finishing is that it's so slow. But then heavy attacks, so wind up, that one is a little tricky, because a lot of the things that give you the wind up speed on your heavy weapon, are your heavy melee build weapon, are things that are kind of free. So for example, the two sources of heavy attack of wind up speed are Killing Blow and Amalgam Organ Shatter. And those are kind of free. Like, you just want to run those anyway most of the time, but there are ways that you could finagle a build to get some advantage out of that. I can't immediately give you a specific weapon example, but to give you an example conceptually, there are weapons that have heavy attacks that hit multiple times, like I would assume two-handed swords, that will, they have the opportunity to use condition overload effectively. And a lot of them force procs. I don't know if two dual-wielded swords. I said two-handed swords before, didn't I? You know what I mean, dual-wielded dual swords. There we go. Those weapons have the opportunity to use condition overload, and the main reason not to most of the time is that you could just use prime pressure point and Killing Blow, and you're getting free at like speed on your heavy attacks too, but you already have that, so you're encouraged to really go wild with getting every greedy melee mod that affects your heavy attacks, and you can build up a ton of status chance and run all these different status effects, and then do a big heavy attack that hits a couple of times, maybe has like crazy high status chance on each hit, and you could get multiple statuses, and that increases your damage ceiling while keeping your heavy attacks really fast. Now, the Amalgam Organ Shatter thing versus Organ Shatter, like, it practically does no less damage, so it's basically free. So we would have to live in a world where Amalgam Organ Shatter is made properly, actually meaningfully weaker than normal Organ Shatter, because at the moment it's like Organ Shatter gives you 90% crit damage, Amalgam Organ Shatter gives you 85% crit damage. Who cares? Like, just always use Amalgam Organ Shatter. It doesn't do anything different. So it would need to be taken down to like 75% crit damage, and then it's like still very good, but meaningfully lower than 90%, and you will actually notice like the damage being a bit lower. In exchange for that wind-up speed, which means then you indirectly get this other thing. That might be a little niche. I kind of like having these really niche augments sometimes, especially on frames like Excalibur that are the opposite of niche. Like, Excalibur is ubiquitous, of course, the most owned frame because it's the most popular starter by a landslide. I wonder if that's still true, but I'm sure it is. Excalibur used to be like 80% of people started with Excalibur, and then the other 15% started with Volt, and like 5% started with Mag, or something crazy like that. It was probably even more severe than that, but it's probably not that bad now, I would hope. But Excalibur is still surely the most commonly owned frame in the game. And he's very general. He's a simple, effective frame. And so giving him an ultra-specific augment feels sensible, because he's a frame that is, you don't need to get people to like him anymore. It's just like, why not give us something different to do with him? That also has that same balancing principle I mentioned before, where you getting all this power on a melee weapon but Excalibur already has Exalted Blade, so there's some incentive to just not use this and use Exalted Blade instead. What you're getting in exchange is a lot of speed. Now, Exalted Blade can already be fast, and it's got the Blade Waves, but this is giving you more of a sure one-hit kill. Think of two-handed Nakanas doing heavy attacks. Like it's so much damage, and they get a force slash proc. That is more of a sure one-hit kill than Exalted Blade is, but you are losing the sort of brawling potential in exchange for a more assassin-type Excalibur, potentially. And again, realistically, this attack speed passive I buffed for Excalibur is probably mostly effective when you're a newer player and you don't have Exalted Blade fully built out yet. It's probably not so useful to use one of those melee weapons instead of Exalted Blade just because they have a bit more attack speed. But it's not impossible that it would be good too. I don't know. Again, it's hard because we have to fix the passives at the same time. I think my big takeaway here is that a lot of passives are not very good. But let's do one more, shall we? Ooh, this one ended up being pretty long, okay. What's a passive that I am interested in? There's just so many that are kind of basic, and I really want them to be buffed first, you know? Like Rhino, I'm really interested in that. His fart when he hits the ground really hard. It's just so weak though. Like it needs to be a better passive first, you know. And I want to find one that I don't need to buff first. I want something where it's sort of fine. I have a weird idea for one, but again, this is also just not a great passive. Valkyr has that passive where she doesn't get hard landings. You can always just crouch to get rid of a hard landing, but whatever, let's just leave that one for a sec. My idea is that when Valkyr falls from a high height where she would have gotten a hard landing, with this augment she gets a speed boost when she falls from really high up. Sick drift frame tech, you have to fall from really high up in the air, maybe using your rip line to get high in the air and then fall, and then you get a speed boost as long as you fall really far. So that would make it more interesting. Maybe that should just be the innate passive, but again, obviously you'd want to buff the passive to have some benefit when you fall from really high up, like something happens, or you know, when you're in midair you take less damage. I don't know, that's too similar to other stuff, but you get the point. I think it would be cool to add a mechanic that was like, you get speed for falling very far, and play into her cat-like sensibility where she can really hit the ground running. Maybe it should just be when she hits the ground, she gets a little speed increase. I guess that could be her passive, and then when she falls really far, she gets a bigger speed increase for some reason. I don't know, like it'll be like an adrenaline-themed thing. She fell really far, so now she's like, I'm falling, and I have to go really fast or something. I don't know. I think the moral of the story here is that a lot of augments, yes, a lot of augments, but a lot of passives need help. And I hope this was also a good exercise in recognizing, like, I said that thing for Valkyr, and it's like, no, that should just be her passive. Like, that shouldn't be an augment. That should, you change her passive. Like, I know we need to buff Valkyr's passive, but cool. This was a fun one to play with a little bit. I really had a lot of trouble thinking of good examples. I scouted some out before I answered this question, but I wasn't satisfied with most of them. Like I'd use the Oberon one, but there are a couple others I wrote down here that I don't like. Like they're not. It's hard. There are not so many that I feel like the passive is already solid, and then you can evolve it so for another example, Wisp I think has a really solid passive, like totally noticeable and impactful, but not overpowered or anything. It's a good passive. It defines the character a little bit. It's a solid passive. But I don't know what to add to it. You know, I'm not sure. You could do something boring like, so I'll tell you the idea I had for that was to make it persist a little bit after you hit the ground. But I just don't care. You know what I mean? Like whatever, sure. But I don't know. And she can already deploy her second ability to get her passive, so I'm not sure. So it's challenging, but it's an interesting idea, and I would legitimately love to see more Warframe passive augments. I hope that they allow Nezha and Zephyr and Titania to get them, even though they got those ones that remove their passive, because it would be a shame if they didn't get that fifth augment just because some people don't like their passive. Which again, it's fine if some people don't like their passive. It feels like a shame if they can't use that design space just because some people don't like to butt scoot, which, like, again, that's totally okay. I get it. my philosophy is kind of that like there are so many other frames. And then the titanium thing is just ridiculous. Faber, thank you very much for your support, and I appreciate your very interesting question that I answered in a surprisingly long-winded manner. Wow.